Hello and welcome to Nighttime Biographies. Tonight we journey into the life of a man who held more than 1,000 patents, who gave the modern world its electric light, its recorded sound, its moving pictures. We will follow Thomas Alva Edison from a sickly child dismissed as too stupid to learn, to the most famous inventor on Earth. We will watch him work through nights without sleep, fail thousands of times before succeeding, and build an empire from wire and filament and the sheer force of his will. We will see him transform from a telegraph operator barely scraping by into a wizard whose laboratory produced marvels that seemed like magic. We will understand why his name still means innovation, why the light bulb remains the universal symbol of a good idea, and why the man who couldn't hear properly changed how the entire world listens. Before we begin this journey into the life of America's greatest inventor, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. I'm always curious where in the world you're watching from tonight, so please leave a comment and tell me. And now, settle in as we travel back to witness the extraordinary life of Thomas Edison. On October 18th, 1931, in a bedroom on the second floor of Glenmont, his sprawling estate in West Orange, New Jersey, an 84-year-old man lay dying. Thomas Alva Edison, the Wizard of Menlo Park, the Napoleon of invention, the man who had promised to make electricity so cheap that only the rich would burn candles, was slipping away. The room was filled with autumn light filtering through heavy curtains. His wife Mina sat beside the bed, holding his hand as she had for the past weeks of his decline. The doctors had given up. There was nothing more they could do for the complications of diabetes, the kidney disease, the gastric ulcer that had been bleeding slowly for months. Edison drifted in and out of consciousness. His once powerful frame, the body that had worked 18-hour days for decades, barely made an impression beneath the blankets. His famous shock of white hair spread across the pillow. The hands that had sketched thousands of inventions, that had assembled the first phonograph, that had tested filament after filament in search of the perfect light, lay still. At one point in the early morning hours of October 17th, he had seemed to rally. His eyes opened with something of their old intensity. Mina leaned close to hear him speak. "It is very beautiful over there," Edison whispered. She wasn't certain what he meant. Over where? Was he seeing something beyond the room, beyond this world? The great rationalist, the man of science who had little patience for mysticism or religion, seemed to be describing a vision. Those were his last coherent words. Through the morning of October 18th, his breathing grew shallower. At 3:24 in the afternoon, Thomas Edison took his final breath and was still. The man who had illuminated the world went dark. Consider the strangeness of what I've just described. Here was someone who changed human civilization more thoroughly than most kings or presidents. He didn't conquer territory or write laws, yet his inventions reshaped how billions of people would live. He gave us the light bulb, but also the entire system of electrical distribution that makes modern life possible. He gave us the phonograph, allowing human voices to be heard long after death. He gave us motion pictures, creating an entirely new art form. He held 1,093 US patents, more than any inventor in American history. He built the first industrial research laboratory, inventing the very process of systematic invention itself. And yet, this same man had only 3 months of formal schooling. He was partially deaf from childhood. He failed thousands of times. He worked for years without significant success. He faced bankruptcy, fires that destroyed years of work, ridicule from scientists who called him a mere tinkerer. The path from that schoolroom in Dearest, Michigan, where a teacher called him addled, to that deathbed in New Jersey, where the world held its breath, was anything but straight. But to understand how Thomas Edison became who he became, we cannot start with the patents. We must start with the place. We must understand the world that made him. A world of candles and gas lamps, of silence except for living voices, of movement captured only in still photographs. A world that had no idea what was coming. To understand Thomas Edison, you must first understand the America he was born into, a nation transforming itself at breathtaking speed from rural farmland to industrial power. The year 1847 found the United States on the cusp of enormous change. The Mexican-American War was ending, adding vast territories to the Republic. The telegraph, invented just 3 years earlier, was beginning to stitch the sprawling nation together with wires that carried messages at the speed of lightning. Railroads were pushing west, factories were rising in the north. But for most Americans, life remained much as it had been for centuries. Cities were lit by gas lamps, or not at all. The countryside was dark after sunset except for candles and hearth fires. News travelled at the speed of a horse. Entertainment meant live performance or reading by dim light. Recorded sound did not exist. Moving pictures were unimaginable. If you wanted music, someone had to play an instrument. If you wanted light, you struck a match. The young nation was hungry for innovation, for the practical solutions that could tame a continent and build an economy. Americans celebrated inventors with an enthusiasm that older European nations reserved for artists and philosophers. The patent system, enshrined in the Constitution itself, protected inventors' rights and encouraged experimentation. It was into this world of possibility and transformation that Thomas Alva Edison was born on February 11th, 1847, in Milan, Ohio. Milan was a canal town, one of thousands of small settlements that dotted the American Midwest in the antebellum period. The Milan Canal connected the town to Lake Erie, making it a shipping hub for grain from the surrounding farmland. In the mid-1840s, Milan was prosperous and growing, its warehouses full, its future bright. Samuel Edison, Thomas's father, was not from Milan originally. He was Canadian by birth, from a loyalist family that had fled the American colonies during the Revolution. Samuel had been involved in a failed Canadian rebellion in 1837, fighting against British colonial rule. When the rebellion collapsed, he fled to the United States one step ahead of arrest, leaving behind his previous life and starting over in Ohio. He was a man of energy and ambition, but also of inconsistent success. He tried his hand at various businesses: innkeeping, lumber, grain dealing, real estate speculation. Some ventures thrived briefly, others failed. By the time his youngest son was born, Samuel was operating a lumber business and a tower-building venture in Milan, doing well enough to provide for his growing family. Nancy Elliott Edison, Thomas's mother, came from a very different background. She was educated, refined, the daughter of a Presbyterian minister from New York State. She had worked as a schoolteacher before her marriage, unusual for women of her era. Nancy brought to the rough frontier household a love of learning, a collection of books, and firm ideas about education and moral development. She was intense, protective of her children, and determined that they would have opportunities she could provide. Thomas was the youngest of 7 children, though 3 of his siblings died in childhood, a common tragedy in the 19th century. By the time he arrived, Nancy was 37 years old, Samuel was 43. The family was established but not wealthy, respectable but not socially prominent. There was nothing in his birth to suggest that this particular infant would become anything extraordinary. The name they gave him carried family history. Thomas came from his paternal grandfather. Alva honoured a family friend and business associate, Captain Alva Bradley. The baby was small, with an unusually large head that worried his parents and the attending physician. For the first months of his life, there was genuine concern that he might not survive, or that the size of his head indicated some developmental problem. But Thomas Edison proved tougher than he appeared. He survived, and Nancy, having lost children before, watched him with particular care. The house where he was born still stands in Milan, a simple brick structure that has been preserved as a museum. It was a modest but comfortable home, 2 stories, built in the style of the period with the efficiency frontier life required. Young Thomas would have spent his early years in these rooms, surrounded by the bustle of his siblings, the coming and going of his father's business associates, and his mother's quiet but persistent presence. The first significant event of his childhood came when he was 7 years old. The family left Milan. The canal that had made the town prosperous was being supplanted by the railroad. Tracks were being laid across Ohio, and they bypassed Milan. Almost overnight, the town's economic future collapsed. Warehouses that had been full stood empty. The traffic that had flowed through Milan now went elsewhere. Samuel Edison, always ready to chase opportunity, decided to move the family to Port Huron, Michigan, a growing town on the St. Clair River. In 1854, the Edison family relocated, and Thomas Edison's real education was about to begin, though not in any classroom. Port Huron in the 1850s was a lumber town, a place of sawmills and forests, of ships on the Great Lakes and the smell of pine. The Edison family settled into a house near the Fort Gratiot military reservation, on the outskirts of the growing town. Samuel built a 100-foot observation tower near their home, charging tourists 25 cents to climb it and view the river and the distant Canadian shore. It was typical of his entrepreneurial ventures: clever, requiring minimal capital, moderately successful. For young Thomas, now called Al by his family to distinguish him from his father, Port Huron was a world to explore. The forests, the river, the railroad tracks that ran past their property all became his laboratory. He was a curious child, constantly asking questions. Why does a goose sit on its eggs? He tried sitting on goose eggs himself to see if he could hatch them. Why do things burn? He set fire to his father's barn to observe the process, earning a public whipping in the town square as punishment. His questions were relentless, his experiments alarming to adults who couldn't understand his drive to test everything he wondered about. In 1855, when Al was 8 years old, his parents enrolled him in the one-room schoolhouse in Port Huron. It was his first formal education, and it would also be his last. The teacher was Reverend G.B. Engel, a man with traditional ideas about education that involved rote memorization, strict discipline, and little tolerance for the kind of questions Al Edison asked. Al struggled immediately. He asked too many questions. He couldn't sit still. His mind wandered during recitations. To a teacher managing dozens of students in a single room, ranging from 6 to 16 years old, Al Edison was a problem. After 3 months, Al came home one day in tears. He told his mother that he'd overheard Reverend Engel telling an inspector that Al Edison was addled, confused, incapable of learning, perhaps mentally deficient. The large head that had worried his parents at birth now seemed to confirm the teacher's assessment. Nancy Edison was furious. She marched to the schoolhouse and confronted the teacher. According to family accounts, she told Engel that he didn't know what he was talking about, that her son was more intelligent than the teacher, himself, and that she would educate Thomas at home where he could learn properly. It was a bold move for a woman in 1855, and it changed Thomas Edison's life completely. Nancy Edison became her son's teacher, and she was unlike any teacher he might have encountered in the public schools. She didn't drill him in rote facts or punish him for asking questions. Instead, she turned him loose in the world of books. The transformation was immediate and profound. For the first time in his young life, Al Edison could learn at his own pace, following his curiosity wherever it led, without a teacher telling him to sit still, be quiet, and memorize meaningless facts. Nancy's approach was revolutionary for the 1850s. She believed that education should kindle interest rather than enforce conformity. She gave him her own childhood favourites: Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, Hume's History of England, Sears' History of the World, and most importantly, Parker's Natural and Experimental Philosophy. This last book was particularly important. It contained descriptions of scientific experiments, complete with instructions that a curious boy could follow. It explained principles of mechanics, chemistry, and electricity in practical terms, showing not just what happened, but how to make it happen yourself. Al Edison didn't just read it. He performed every experiment it described one by one, methodically working through the entire volume. He turned the basement of the Edison home into his first laboratory, a space that would have horrified any safety inspector, but which Nancy defended as essential to her son's education. She gave him complete freedom to experiment, even when explosions occasionally rocked the house, or strange smells drifted up from the cellar. While Samuel Edison considered it dangerous nonsense, a waste of time and money that could be better spent on practical work, Nancy understood that her son was learning more in that basement than he ever would have in a classroom. She scraped together money for him to buy chemicals and equipment from the local apothecary. She allowed him to commandeer household items for his experiments: dishes, bottles, tools, whatever he needed. The basement laboratory grew until it contained hundreds of bottles, each carefully labelled in Al's precise handwriting. He created a systematic organisation for his materials, categorising chemicals by type and use. He marked dangerous substances with skulls and crossbones, and when that didn't adequately deter his curious siblings, he labelled the most hazardous bottles "Poison" in large letters. This wasn't mere show. Al was working with mercury, phosphorus, sulfuric acid, and other substances that could kill or maim if mishandled. He learned caution through small burns and accidents, developing a healthy respect for the power of chemistry. His experiments ranged from the simple to the ambitious. He created batteries following Franklin's descriptions, connecting cups of acid with metal strips to generate electrical current. He built a working telegraph using materials scavenged from around the house. He synthesized basic compounds, fascinated by how mixing two clear liquids could produce brilliant colors or noxious gases. He dissected dead animals to understand anatomy, pickled specimens in jars, and attempted to preserve biological samples following descriptions in books. Nancy watched all of this with approval, recognizing that her son's drive to understand how things worked was the mark of a genuine scientific mind. She didn't understand the experiments herself, chemistry and physics being far outside her education, but she understood that Al understood them, and that was enough. When neighbours commented critically on the strange child who spent all his time reading or conducting dangerous experiments, Nancy defended him firmly. By the age of 10, Al had read Newton's Principia, though he later admitted he didn't understand it fully. The mathematics were beyond him, and Newton's formal proofs meant little to a boy who thought in concrete terms. But he grasped the fundamental concepts. that motion followed laws, that forces produced predictable effects, that the universe operated according to principles that could be discovered and described. He read Burton's Anatomy of Melancholy, a sprawling 17th century examination of human psychology and emotion. He read the plays of Shakespeare, memorizing speeches that caught his fancy. He devoured books on chemistry, physics, mechanics, whatever he could find. His mother didn't direct his reading. She simply made books available and encouraged his hunger for knowledge. The library in their home was modest, perhaps 200 volumes, but Al read everything in it, some books multiple times. Then he convinced the town librarian to let him borrow books, working his way systematically through shelf after shelf. He started at one end of the library and read forward, taking books home in stacks, returning them within days and checking out more. By his early teens, Al had read more than most adults would read in a lifetime, absorbing information about history, science, technology, philosophy, and literature. His mind became a vast repository of facts, ideas, and techniques that he would draw on for the rest of his life. Nancy also taught him practical skills that the basement experiments alone wouldn't provide. She showed him how to organize his work, how to keep records of experiments so results could be replicated, how to think through problems systematically before attempting solutions. These were research skills that would serve him throughout his career as an inventor. She encouraged him to write down his observations, to sketch his ideas, to maintain notebooks that documented his thinking. This habit of documentation, instilled by Nancy, would later result in the thousands of pages of laboratory notebooks that tracked Edison's inventions through every stage of development. Years later, when Edison had become famous and reporters asked about his education, he would say, "My mother was the making of me. She was so true, so sure of me, and I felt I had someone to live for, someone I must not disappoint." It was not empty sentiment. Nancy Edison had seen potential in a boy that his teacher had dismissed as addled. She had bet everything on that potential, removing him from school and taking responsibility for his education herself. It was a remarkable act of faith and courage for a woman in the 1850s to reject the authority of professional educators and trust her own judgment. If she had been wrong, if Al had been truly incapable of learning as Reverend Ingle claimed, she would have ruined her son's future. But she was right. The formal school system had rejected him. His mother saved him, giving him not just knowledge but the confidence to trust his own mind, to ask questions without fear, and to believe that he could solve any problem through persistent effort. These lessons, more than any specific fact or skill, shaped Thomas Edison's entire approach to invention and life. But reading and home experiments, however enthusiastic, don't feed a family. By age 12, Al needed to contribute to the household income. The railroad that had bypassed Milan had reached Port Huron, and it would provide Thomas Edison with his real education, teaching him lessons no book could convey. In 1859, the Grand Trunk Railway completed its line connecting Port Huron to Detroit, opening opportunities for anyone enterprising enough to seize them. 12-year-old Al Edison saw his chance. The railroad ran 3 trains daily between Port Huron and Detroit, a 70-mile journey that took several hours each way. Passengers on these trains needed newspapers, magazines, candy, fruit, anything to make the journey more pleasant. Al proposed to his parents that he work as a news butcher, a vendor who moved through the train cars, selling goods to travellers. He would leave Port Huron early each morning, sell his wares on the journey to Detroit, spend the layover restocking, then sell again on the return trip, arriving home in the evening. Samuel was sceptical. 12 was young for such responsibility, and the work would take Al away from home for 12 to 15 hours daily. But Nancy, surprisingly, supported the idea. Perhaps she recognized that her son needed more stimulation than Port Huron could provide. Perhaps she understood that this would be educational in ways formal schooling never was. Al was granted permission. He would work the trains. What followed was an education in business, chemistry, mechanics, and human nature that no school could have provided. Edison rose each morning at 6 a.m. to catch the 7 a.m. train. He loaded his basket with newspapers purchased on credit from the Detroit Free Press, candies and nuts, and whatever produce was in season. On the train, he moved through the cars calling out his wares, learning quickly which passengers were likely customers, how to pitch his goods, how to make change and keep his accounts. The profit margins were thin but consistent. He could make a few dollars per day, real money for a 12-year-old in 1859. But Edison wasn't content with simply selling newspapers. He convinced the train's baggage master to let him use part of the baggage car for a laboratory. He moved chemicals and equipment from his basement at home, setting up an improvised workspace where he could conduct experiments during the layover in Detroit. He also noticed something about the newspaper business. Newspapers were printed in the morning with the day's news, but interesting stories could happen any time. If a big story broke, people would buy more papers. Edison began reading the newspapers before boarding, judging which stories would attract buyers. When something significant happened, a battle in the Civil War, which had begun in 1861, a political scandal, a disaster, he would buy more papers, knowing demand would be high. This was business sense, the ability to read market demand and adjust supply accordingly. Then Edison took it further. In 1862, he convinced the local telegraph operators to let him read the news dispatches before they were published. Armed with advanced knowledge of major stories, he would send telegrams ahead to stations down the line, announcing important war news, extra papers available on today's train. When the train arrived, crowds would be waiting, and Edison would sell out his entire stock at premium prices. He was 15 years old and had figured out how to create demand through information advantage and targeted marketing. His next innovation was even bolder. Why sell other people's newspapers when he could publish his own? In 1862, Edison launched the Weekly Herald, the first newspaper ever published on a moving train. He bought a small printing press and installed it in the baggage car alongside his laboratory. He gathered news from telegraph operators, wrote brief articles about local events and train schedules, and printed the paper during the layover in Detroit. He sold it on the return journey for 3 cents per copy. At its peak, the Weekly Herald had a circulation of 400 copies. It lasted only a few months before the printing press was banished from the train after a mishap involving chemicals, but it demonstrated Edison's willingness to try anything, to combine different skills and technologies in novel ways. The incident that ended the laboratory and printing press came when a stick of phosphorus fell during a sharp turn, starting a fire in the baggage car. The conductor, furious, threw Edison and all his equipment off the train at the next station. According to some accounts, the conductor also boxed Edison's ears so hard that it contributed to his hearing loss, though this story may be apocryphal. Edison's partial deafness probably had multiple causes, including childhood illness. Regardless, by 1862, Edison was increasingly deaf, a condition that would worsen throughout his life until he could barely hear conversation. Surprisingly, he later claimed his deafness was an advantage, allowing him to concentrate without distraction and to think more clearly. Whether this was genuine or Edison making the best of his limitation is unclear, but he refused to use hearing aids and seemed unconcerned by what others considered a significant disability. The train years taught Edison crucial lessons. He learned business, how to buy low, sell high, manage inventory, understand customer demand. He learned about information, that knowing things before others knew them conveyed power. He learned about printing, about chemistry from his mobile laboratory, about the mechanics of trains and the operation of the railroad. Most importantly, he learned about the telegraph. The railway stations all had telegraph operators, and Edison befriended many of them. He watched them work, asked questions about the equipment, learned the Morse code that converted letters into electrical pulses sent across wires. The telegraph fascinated him in a way nothing had before. Here was technology that seemed almost magical. Information travelling faster than any horse, any train, carried by electricity through copper wires. By 1863, Edison was 16 and ready to move beyond selling papers. He had saved several $100s from his train venture, enough to survive for months if necessary. What he wanted now was to learn telegraphy properly, to become an operator himself. That opportunity came through an act of heroism that may have been somewhat embellished in later retellings, but was real in its essentials. The story goes that in August 1862, Edison was at the Mount Clemens train station when he saw a 3-year-old boy, the son of the station master, playing on the tracks unaware that a freight car was rolling toward him. Edison dropped his papers and ran, snatching the child from the tracks seconds before the car would have crushed him. The boy's father, James Mackenzie, was the station telegrapher. Grateful beyond measure, Mackenzie asked Edison what he could do to repay him. Edison's answer was immediate. "Teach me telegraphy." Mackenzie agreed. For the next several months, Edison spent his free time at Mount Clemens learning the telegraph key, practicing the Morse code, understanding the electrical circuits that made the system work. He proved an apt student, his fingers quick on the key, his mind grasping the technical principles. By late 1863, Edison was ready to work as a telegraph operator, and the timing was perfect. The Civil War was raging, creating enormous demand for telegraphers. Thousands of miles of telegraph wire were being strung across the country to coordinate military operations and transmit news from the battlefields. Operators were in short supply. Men with even modest skills could find work immediately, and those willing to travel could command decent wages. From 1863 to 1868, Thomas Edison worked as an itinerant telegrapher, wandering from job to job across the Midwest and South. He worked night shifts in small offices, day shifts in major cities, for railroad companies and telegraph corporations. He lived in boarding houses, ate cheap meals, and sent most of his wages home to his mother. The jobs never lasted long. Edison had a pattern of behavior that made him unemployable in the long term. He would arrive at a new posting, master the work quickly, then grow bored. Once bored, he would begin modifying the equipment, running experiments, trying to improve the technology. His supervisors, who simply wanted messages sent and received without problems, did not appreciate an operator who took apart the equipment to see if it could be made better. Edison worked in Stratford Junction, Ontario, Adrian, Michigan, Fort Wayne, Indiana, Indianapolis, Cincinnati, Nashville, Memphis, Louisville, Boston. Each job lasted weeks or months before he was fired or quit. Sometimes he was let go for sleeping on night shifts, though he claimed he had invented an automatic signaling device to ping every hour so supervisors would think he was awake. Sometimes he left because he had saved enough money to try inventing something. Sometimes his experiments with the equipment caused it to fail spectacularly, and he was shown the door. In Memphis, he worked the night shift and used the quiet hours to read scientific journals and conduct experiments with the equipment. He subscribed to the Telegrapher magazine and studied everything published about electrical systems. In Louisville, he spent his wages buying equipment and books about electricity. His landlady complained about the chemicals and the strange apparatus filling his rented room. Despite the chaos, these were formative years. Edison learned electrical technology from the inside, not from textbooks, but from hands-on work with equipment that frequently broke down and needed repair. He became expert at diagnosing problems, improvising solutions with whatever materials were available. He learned that most telegraph equipment was poorly designed, that with better engineering it could be faster, more reliable, more capable. Ideas began to accumulate in his mind. Ways to send multiple messages on a single wire, ways to store messages automatically, ways to amplify weak signals. These weren't idle daydreams, but concrete technical solutions to real problems he encountered daily. By 1868, Edison was 21 and had decided that he was done being an employee. He had skills now, knowledge, and a head full of ideas. He wanted to work for himself as an inventor. But wanting to invent and successfully inventing are very different things, and Edison was about to enter the hardest period of his life, years when success seemed perpetually just out of reach. In January 1869, Edison arrived in Boston with grand ambitions and almost no money. He had quit his last telegraph job and decided that Boston, with its concentration of scientific institutions and technical companies, was the place to establish himself as an inventor. He was 21 years old, partially deaf, shabby in appearance, and unknown to anyone who mattered. His first act was to advertise himself in the Telegrapher as available for electrical work and invention. When that produced no clients, he took a job as a telegraph operator for Western Union's Boston office, but only to pay rent while he pursued his real goal. Edison rented a workshop and began spending every moment not required at his day job working on inventions. His first significant project was an improvement to the stock ticker, a device that transmitted stock prices over telegraph wires to brokerage offices. Edison designed a better mechanism that was more reliable and easier to read. He demonstrated it to several Boston businessmen who expressed polite interest but declined to invest. His second project was more ambitious, a vote recorder for legislative bodies. Edison had read about how much time state legislatures wasted on roll call votes, calling each member's name and recording their vote individually. He invented a device where each legislator had a switch at their desk. Turning it one way recorded a yes vote, the other way recorded no. The votes were transmitted electrically to a central recorder that tabulated the results instantly. It was clever, efficient, and completely unwanted. Edison traveled to Washington to demonstrate it to Congress. The congressmen explained patiently that they didn't want faster voting. The time spent on roll calls allowed for lobbying, for changing minds, for the political negotiations that made legislation possible. A device that rushed votes was politically useless. Edison left Washington having learned a crucial lesson. I will never invent anything that is not wanted. Technical cleverness meant nothing if there was no market demand. His workshop and his inventions were consuming money faster than his telegrapher's wages could supply it. He borrowed from friends. He ran up debts with landlords and suppliers. By late 1869, he was effectively broke, living hand to mouth, sleeping in his workshop when he couldn't pay rent on his room. This pattern, brilliance paired with financial disaster, would repeat itself for the next decade of Edison's life. He could solve technical problems with astonishing creativity, but he was terrible at business, at pricing his services, at collecting debts, at managing money. In December 1869, Edison made a decision born of desperation. He would go to New York City, the financial and commercial capital of America, where the market for electrical inventions had to be larger. He scraped together enough money for a steamship ticket to New York and arrived with less than $1 in his pocket. The New York that Edison found in January 1870 was a city of tremendous energy and cutthroat competition. It was also suffering through a particularly harsh winter. Edison, with no money for lodging, no contacts, and no immediate prospects, slept where he could, in the basement of a telegraph office, on benches in battery rooms where the heat from electrical equipment at least kept him from freezing. He was hungry, cold, and desperate. For weeks he survived on the edge of absolute destitution. Then fortune intervened in the form of a broken machine and Edison's ability to fix it. The Gold Indicator Company operated a service that transmitted gold prices to brokerage firms throughout the city. The central transmitting machine, located in a building near Wall Street, was complex, temperamental, and crucial to dozens of businesses that depended on up-to-the-second price information. On a winter day in early 1870, the machine broke down. The office descended into chaos. Brokers were screaming for information. The company's technicians were baffled. The company president, Dr. S.S. Laws, was watching his business collapse. Edison, who'd been hanging around the office hoping for some small repair job that might pay a few dollars, watched the technicians' failed attempts to fix the machine. Finally, he approached Laws and said he thought he knew what was wrong. Laws, with nothing to lose, told him to try. Edison examined the machine, quickly identified a broken spring that had jammed the mechanism, repaired it in a matter of minutes, and got the system running again. Laws was impressed enough to hire him on the spot. Edison became the superintendent of the Gold Indicator Company at $300 per month, an enormous salary for someone who'd been sleeping in basements weeks earlier. For the first time in his life, Edison had financial security and access to equipment and resources. He used both to continue inventing. The Gold Indicator Company gave Edison legitimacy, but he left after a few months to partner with Franklin Pope, a respected electrical engineer who had his own workshop. Together they formed Pope, Edison and Company, electrical engineers and constructors of electrical devices. It was Edison's first company, though it would not be his last. The partnership focused on improving telegraph systems, stock tickers, and related electrical equipment. They did well enough that Edison was no longer worried about immediate survival. He could focus entirely on invention. Between 1870 and 1876, Edison would establish himself as a serious inventor, file dozens of patents, and begin to develop the methodology that would define his later successes. But first, he would need better facilities, steady income, and freedom from the constant financial crisis that had plagued his early years. That stability came from an unexpected source: Western Union, the telegraph giant, which needed Edison's inventive skills as much as he needed their money. In 1870, Western Union faced a problem. The American telegraph system was overwhelmed by demand. The country was expanding rapidly westward. Businesses needed to communicate across vast distances. News agencies wanted to transmit stories instantly, but telegraph lines could only carry one message at a time in each direction. During peak hours, messages were delayed for hours or even days. The solution, installing more wires, was expensive. What Western Union wanted was technology that could send multiple messages simultaneously over a single wire, multiplying capacity without multiplying infrastructure costs. Several inventors were working on this multiplex telegraphy, but none had produced a reliable system. Western Union approached Edison, who by 1871 had established a reputation as someone who could solve difficult technical problems. They offered him funding to develop a multiplex system, along with payment for other improvements to telegraph equipment. The deal gave Edison financial breathing room and access to Western Union's resources. In return, Western Union got first rights to his telegraph inventions. Edison threw himself into the problem with characteristic intensity. He set up a workshop in Newark, New Jersey, where he could work without the distractions of New York City. The Newark workshop was larger and better equipped than anything Edison had access to before. He hired assistants, skilled mechanics, and electrical technicians who could execute his ideas. This was the beginning of Edison's model of collaborative invention. He would conceive the ideas, sketch the designs, and direct the work, while a team of talented craftsmen would build and test the prototypes. The multiplex telegraph proved more difficult than anticipated. The challenge was not just sending multiple signals simultaneously, but preventing them from interfering with each other. Edison tried dozens of approaches, filling notebooks with circuit diagrams and calculations. Finally, he developed a quadruplex system that could send 4 messages, 2 in each direction, over a single wire simultaneously. It was an elegant solution combining electrical innovation with precise timing. Western Union was delighted and paid Edison $10,000 for the patent, more money than he had ever received for a single invention. The quadruplex system was installed on major telegraph routes, effectively quadrupling capacity on those lines. But the invention had complications. Another inventor, Joseph Stearns, claimed he had developed a duplex system first, and that Edison's quadruplex infringed on his patents. A competing telegraph company, the Atlantic and Pacific Telegraph Company, bought Stearns' patents and sued Western Union. The resulting legal battle dragged on for years and exposed Edison to the reality that in American business, patent lawsuits were often as important as the inventions themselves. Despite the legal troubles, the quadruplex system established Edison as one of America's premier telegraph inventors. Money flowed into the Newark workshop. Edison expanded operations, hiring more workers, buying more equipment, taking on more projects. But Edison's personal life was also changing. On Christmas Day 1871, Thomas Edison married Mary Stilwell. Mary was 16 years old, an employee in Edison's Newark factory where she worked assembling telegraph equipment. Edison was 24. Their courtship had been brief and, by all accounts, consisted largely of Edison appearing at her workstation to explain his latest invention while Mary nodded politely, understanding perhaps one word in 10. It was not a marriage of deep emotional connection, but rather of convenience and affection. Mary was sweet-natured, conventional, and completely unprepared for life with a man whose only real passion was invention. Edison would disappear into his workshop for days at a time, sleeping on work benches, forgetting to come home for meals, obsessed with whatever technical problem currently occupied his mind. Mary managed the household, bore him 3 children, Marion in 1873, Thomas Jr. in 1876, and William in 1878, and largely raised them herself while Edison worked. The children would later recall a father who was often absent, occasionally present for brief periods of intense attention, and then gone again to the laboratory. Edison nicknamed his first two children Dot and Dash after telegraph code, a gesture that revealed where his mind lived even in family moments. The Newark years were productive but chaotic. Edison was working on multiple projects simultaneously: improvements to telegraph systems, early work on telephone technology, experiments with electrical pen devices for copying documents. The workshop was constantly busy, often on the edge of financial crisis because Edison spent money on experiments faster than he could collect payment for finished work. By 1876, Edison had decided he needed a different arrangement. The workshop in Newark was too small, too expensive, too close to the distractions of business and city life. What he wanted was a dedicated research facility, a laboratory where he could focus on invention without interruption, where he could pursue multiple projects, where he could turn invention itself into an organized, systematic process. In 1876, Edison chose a small rural community in New Jersey called Menlo Park as the site for his new laboratory. It was 12 miles from Newark, connected by rail but otherwise isolated. He bought land and began construction on a 2-story wooden building that would become the most famous research laboratory in America, the birthplace of inventions that would change the world. The laboratory at Menlo Park opened in March 1876, and it was unlike anything that existed in America at the time. Previous inventors had worked alone or with 1 or 2 assistants, pursuing individual ideas in isolation. They solved specific problems commissioned by clients or developed individual ideas that occurred to them. Edison envisioned something different, something revolutionary in its scope and ambition, an invention factory where systematic research could produce innovations on demand, where creativity could be organized and directed toward practical goals. The main building was 100 feet long and 30 feet wide, 2 stories of open workspace filled with equipment, chemicals, tools, and materials of every description. The structure itself was simple: wood frame construction painted white, surrounded by the flat New Jersey countryside. But inside was a wonderland of possibility. The first floor held a machine shop with lathes, drills, and precision tools for building prototypes. These were not crude workshop tools, but the finest equipment available, capable of machining parts to tolerances of thousandths of an inch. Edison had spent lavishly to equip the space, understanding that good tools were essential for good work. The second floor was Edison's personal laboratory, and it was extraordinary. The walls were lined with shelves containing thousands of chemicals, raw materials, and components. One visitor described it as containing every conceivable material, from the rarest metals to the commonest chemicals, from exotic animal tissues to plant fibers from around the world, from precious stones to chunks of coal. Everything an inventor might possibly need to test an idea was there, organized and labeled, ready to use. Edison had assembled what was essentially a library of matter, where any substance could be pulled from the shelves and incorporated into an experiment. The organizational system was meticulous. Chemicals were categorized by type, acids in one section, bases in another, organic compounds in a third. Metals were arranged by elemental properties. Raw materials were sorted by source and potential application. It was the physical manifestation of Edison's empirical philosophy. If you want to test everything, you need everything available to test. Edison hired a core team of skilled workers who became his partners in innovation, men whose names are less famous than his, but whose contributions were enormous. Charles Batchelor, a British mechanic of extraordinary skill, became Edison's right hand, able to take rough sketches and transform them into working devices with elegant precision. Batchelor understood Edison's mind. could interpret his sometimes vague instructions, and had the mechanical intuition to solve problems Edison identified but couldn't fully articulate. John Crucy, a Swiss clockmaker, brought the precision machining abilities necessary for devices with moving parts. Crucy could build mechanisms with tolerances measured in fractions of a millimeter, creating gears, springs, and levers that worked smoothly for thousands of cycles. His craftsmanship was essential for prototypes that needed to prove not just that an idea worked, but that it could work reliably. William Carman, a chemist, handled the chemical aspects of experiments, mixing compounds, analyzing materials, and keeping Edison's more dangerous inspirations from exploding the laboratory. Carman understood chemical properties and reactions in ways Edison, whose chemistry was largely self-taught and empirical, did not. These men and a dozen others formed the team that would work alongside Edison for the next decade. They were young, mostly in their 20s, energetic and willing to work the insane hours Edison demanded. They were also talented enough to contribute their own ideas, not merely executing Edison's vision but improving and extending it. The laboratory operated on Edison's schedule, which meant it operated constantly. He would work 18-hour days routinely, sometimes going 48 or 72 hours without sleep when pursuing a particularly promising line of research. He expected his assistants to match his pace, at least when he was present. The culture of the laboratory was intense but also strangely joyful. Despite the long hours and demanding work, despite Edison's occasional temper when experiments failed, the mood was often light-hearted. Edison would tell jokes, organize practical pranks, and encourage his workers to relax by singing songs or telling stories during breaks. He was not a distant boss, but a hands-on collaborator who worked alongside his employees, getting his hands dirty, sharing their frustrations and their triumphs. Food was brought in, eaten at workbenches, crumbs brushed aside to make room for circuit diagrams or chemical equations. Edison's methodology at Menlo Park was based on relentless experimentation, on trying everything until something worked. When approaching a problem, he didn't rely on theory alone or trust theoretical predictions about what should work. He tested everything empirically, trying every possibility, failing repeatedly until success emerged. The process might seem wasteful to those trained in more theoretical approaches, but it worked. Edison would sketch an idea, explain it to his assistants, and they would build prototypes. These would be tested immediately, without ceremony or delay. If a prototype failed, as most did, they would analyze why, modify the design, and test again. Failure was expected, almost welcomed, because each failure eliminated one possibility and pointed toward others. This empirical approach, dismissive of pure theory and focused on what actually worked in practice, rather than what should work in principle, would become Edison's signature and the source of both admiration and criticism throughout his career. Academic scientists trained in theoretical physics and chemistry often looked down on Edison as a mere tinkerer who didn't understand the principles behind his inventions. Edison, for his part, had little patience for scientists who could explain why something should work but couldn't make it actually work. "I can always hire mathematicians," he supposedly said, "but they can't hire me." There was tension between Edison's practical empiricism and the more theoretical approach of university-trained scientists, a tension that reflected broader debates about the nature of invention and the relationship between science and technology. The first major project at Menlo Park was improving the telephone. Alexander Graham Bell had invented the telephone in 1876, but Bell's design had significant limitations. The transmitter was weak, voices faded over distance, and the system required users to shout to be heard. Western Union hired Edison to develop a better telephone system, partly to compete with Bell, and partly because they recognized Edison's talent for taking rough inventions and making them practical. Edison attacked the problem with his usual energy. He tested hundreds of materials for the transmitter, looking for something that would vary its electrical resistance in response to sound waves more effectively than Bell's design. He tried platinum, he tried graphite, he tried carbon in various forms. Finally, he discovered that a button of compressed carbon, when vibrated by sound waves, produced a strong, clear electrical signal. The carbon button transmitter became the standard for telephone systems for the next century. It was Edison's improvement, more than Bell's original invention, that made the telephone practical for widespread use. Bell received credit for inventing the telephone. Edison made it work. Western Union was satisfied and paid well. But Edison's next invention would be entirely his own, without precedent, creating something that had never existed before, a machine that could record sound and play it back. The phonograph was born from a question Edison asked himself in 1877. If sound waves could be converted to electrical signals that vibrated a diaphragm, could those vibrations be recorded mechanically and then reproduced? The idea consumed him. For weeks, Edison and his team worked on designs. The concept was straightforward. Sound waves would vibrate a diaphragm attached to a stylus. The stylus would indent a pattern into a rotating cylinder wrapped in tinfoil. To play back, the process would reverse. The stylus would follow the indentations, vibrating the diaphragm, recreating the sound. In December 1877, Edison sketched the design and handed it to John Crucy with instructions to build it. Crucy, thinking it couldn't possibly work, made a bet with Edison that it wouldn't. A few days later, the device was ready. It was crude. A brass cylinder, a hand crank, a diaphragm with a needle attached. Edison wrapped the cylinder in tinfoil, positioned the needle, turned the crank, and recited into the diaphragm. Mary had a little lamb. Its fleece was white as snow, and everywhere that Mary went, the lamb was sure to go. He reset the needle to the beginning, turned the crank again, and from the machine came his own voice, tinny and faint but unmistakable, reciting the nursery rhyme. The men in the workshop were stunned. They had built the device, but even they hadn't quite believed it would work. Crucy paid his bet. Edison immediately recognized the significance. For all of human history, sound had been ephemeral. Voices, music, all sound existed only in the moment of its creation and then vanished forever. Now sound could be captured, stored, transported, replayed. The implications were staggering. Edison wrote an article for Scientific American describing 15 possible applications: recording books for the blind, preserving family voices, creating musical archives, dictation machines, teaching pronunciation, recording wills and testimony, creating music boxes, announcing time, capturing the last words of dying people. In February 1878, Edison demonstrated the phonograph to the editors of Scientific American in New York. They were astounded. The magazine published a detailed article, and overnight Edison became famous. Newspapers across America and Europe reported on the talking machine. Edison was invited to Washington, where he demonstrated the phonograph for President Rutherford B. Hayes at the White House. Hayes was so fascinated he kept Edison demonstrating until nearly midnight. The press began calling Edison the Wizard of Menlo Park, a nickname that would follow him for the rest of his life. Public demonstrations drew crowds. Edison took the phonograph on tour, presenting it to audiences who had never imagined such a thing possible. People lined up for hours just to hear a machine speak. But the phonograph had problems. The tinfoil wore out after a few playbacks. The sound quality was poor. There was no practical market yet. Edison put the phonograph aside, intending to return to it later, and turned to a problem that he believed would be even more significant: electric light. In 1878, electric light existed but was impractical for most uses. Arc lamps, which created light by sparking electricity between two carbon rods, were bright enough for streets or large public spaces, but far too intense, harsh, and unstable for homes. They hissed and sputtered, consumed enormous amounts of power, and required constant adjustment as the carbon rods burned away. A few inventors had created incandescent lamps, where electricity heated a filament in a vacuum bulb until it glowed, but none had solved the fundamental problems that made them commercially useless. Filaments burned out quickly, often within minutes or hours. The systems were expensive and unreliable, and no infrastructure existed to deliver electricity to homes and buildings. Edison surveyed the situation with his characteristic confidence and made a decision that seemed absurd in its ambition. He would not simply invent a better light bulb, he would create an entire system. The bulb itself, yes, but also the wiring to carry electricity safely through buildings, the generators to produce steady electrical current, the distribution network to bring power from central stations to customers, the meters to measure usage, the switches and sockets and fuses, everything needed to light homes and cities with electricity. It was a monumentally complex undertaking that required solving dozens of interconnected problems simultaneously, any one of which might prove insurmountable. In September 1878, with the confidence that had served him well before and would sometimes lead him astray, Edison announced publicly that he would have practical electric light ready within months, perhaps weeks. The announcement caused panic in gas company stocks on both sides of the Atlantic. Investors, believing that the Wizard of Menlo Park could deliver on his promises, began withdrawing money from gas lighting companies and seeking opportunities in electrical ventures. Gas company stocks lost substantial value overnight. This was premature, as Edison would discover over the next year of grueling work, but it demonstrated the power of his reputation and the public's faith in his ability to solve seemingly impossible problems. Edison formed the Edison Electric Light Company to fund the research, selling shares to wealthy investors who were betting on his genius. The investors included J.P. Morgan, the powerful banker, and members of the Vanderbilt family, along with other wealthy New Yorkers who could afford to speculate on new technology. With capital secured, several $100,000, an enormous sum for research in that era, Edison assembled his team and began one of the most intensive research efforts in the history of invention. The laboratory at Menlo Park transformed into a facility dedicated almost entirely to the electric light problem. Every resource was directed toward finding a solution. The central challenge, the problem that defeated every previous inventor who had attempted incandescent lighting, was the filament. It needed to resist the tremendous heat of electrical current, passing through it without burning up, oxidizing, or melting. It needed to glow brightly and steadily with relatively little power, making the system economical to operate. It needed to last for hundreds or ideally thousands of hours of use so that replacing bulbs wouldn't be an impossible burden. And it needed to be made from materials cheap enough that the lights could be produced affordably. Edison tried everything. He started with platinum because of its extraordinarily high melting point. Platinum can withstand temperatures that would vaporize most other metals. He designed elaborate systems where platinum filaments would be cooled with blasts of air when they got too hot, automatically regulating temperature. It worked, briefly, but platinum was phenomenally expensive, and the cooling systems were complex and unreliable. He tried various forms of carbon, graphite, lampblack, carbonized paper. Carbon could withstand high temperatures and glowed well, but early carbon filaments were inconsistent and fragile, breaking easily or burning through rapidly. Each material was tested methodically, its performance recorded in laboratory notebooks in meticulous detail, its failures analyzed to understand what went wrong. Week after week, month after month, filaments glowed briefly in vacuum bulbs and then burned out, failed, disappeared in tiny explosions of light and smoke. By early 1879, Edison's team had tested hundreds of materials and configurations. They were making progress, incremental improvements in filament life and brightness. But the breakthrough that would make commercial lighting practical still eluded them. And the announcements Edison had made so confidently in September were coming back to haunt him. He'd promised electric light quickly, within months, and now nearly a year had passed with no marketable product. Gas company stocks began to recover. Some of Edison's investors grew nervous, wondering if they'd bet wrong. Critics began to emerge, including some prominent scientists and engineers who argued that Edison's approach was fundamentally flawed, that he was a mere tinkerer who didn't understand the theoretical limits of what he was attempting, that incandescent lighting on a commercial scale was probably impossible. The criticism stung, particularly because some of it came from men with impressive academic credentials, professors of physics and engineering from prestigious universities who published articles explaining why Edison's project was doomed to fail. Edison responded to criticism with characteristic defiance and humor. When a reporter asked about his thousands of failures, Edison's response became famous. "I have not failed. I've just found 10,000 ways that won't work." Whether he actually said exactly this or the quote was polished by reporters is unclear, but it captured his methodology perfectly. Each failed experiment wasn't wasted effort but valuable information, eliminating possibilities and narrowing the search for what would work. The breakthrough came in October 1879, after more than a year of relentless experimentation. Edison had been working with carbonized cotton thread as a filament material. The process was delicate and exacting. Take a cotton thread, coil it carefully into the shape needed, place it in a mold, and heat it in the absence of oxygen until it carbonized, transforming the organic fiber into a delicate carbon filament. The carbonization had to be perfect. Too little heat and the thread wouldn't fully carbonize, remaining weak and inconsistent. Too much heat and it would crumble to ash. On October 21, 1879, after numerous failed attempts that taught them gradually how to control the carbonization process, Edison's team successfully created a carbonized cotton filament that lasted 13.5 hours, longer than any previous attempt by a significant margin. They refined the process over the following days, testing variations of the technique, adjusting temperature and timing. By early November, they had filaments lasting 40 hours, then 100 hours, then longer still. The carbon filament thin as a hair, sealed in a glass bulb with the air evacuated to create a vacuum, glowed with a warm, steady golden light when electrical current passed through it. It was beautiful, practical, and revolutionary. Edison knew immediately that he had succeeded in the fundamental task. The incandescent bulb was now viable, but the filament was only part of the system. Edison spent the next months developing everything else needed for practical electrical lighting. He designed generators that could produce steady electrical current. He created wiring systems that could deliver electricity safely to multiple lights. He invented switches, fuses, meters to measure usage, and sockets for the bulbs. He worked out the economics, calculating how cheaply he could produce electricity to compete with gas lighting. On New Year's Eve 1879, Edison staged a public demonstration at Menlo Park. He strung electric lights throughout the laboratory and surrounding buildings. He invited reporters, investors, and the public to come see electric light in action. Thousands of people arrived by train from New York and Philadelphia. They walked through buildings lit entirely by electricity, bright, steady, and safe. They saw lights turned on and off with simple switches. They witnessed something that gas lighting could never achieve: clean, controllable, indoor illumination without flames, without soot, without danger of fire. The newspapers the next day reported that the age of electric light had arrived. But Edison knew the demonstration was just theatre. The real work was building a commercial system that could light an entire city. In 1880, Edison moved his operations from Menlo Park to New York City, setting up a laboratory on Fifth Avenue and establishing the infrastructure needed to electrify a section of Lower Manhattan. The project was monumentally complex. Edison would need to build a central power station with enormous generators. He would need to lay underground cables through city streets. He would need to wire buildings, install fixtures, manufacture light bulbs by the thousands. Most challenging, he would need to do all this while perfecting a technology that was still in development. The system Edison designed was direct current, or DC. Electricity flowed from the power station through copper cables to customers, powering their lights. This system had limitations, particularly the distance electricity could travel before voltage dropped too low. But it was the most practical approach with 1880s technology. Edison chose a district in Lower Manhattan, bounded by Wall Street, the financial heart of New York, as his demonstration area. If he could electrify this densely built commercial district, he could prove that electric light was viable for cities. For 2 years, Edison's workers dug trenches through New York streets, laying miles of underground cable. They installed junction boxes, ran wires into buildings, trained electricians to install fixtures. Edison personally supervised solving problems as they arose, modifying designs, pushing the project forward. The central power station was built at 257 Pearl Street, a building Edison equipped with 6 massive steam-powered generators. These jumbo dynamos, each weighing 27 tons, were the largest electrical generators ever built. They would convert mechanical energy from steam engines into electrical current, feeding the distribution system. On September 4th, 1882, everything was ready. At 3 p.m., Edison threw the switch at the Pearl Street station. Current flowed through the underground cables. In offices throughout the district, electric lights flickered on. The incandescent bulbs glowed with steady, bright light. No flames, no smoke, just the warm radiance of electricity converted to light. The New York Times, whose offices were among the first wired, reported the next day that electric light was soft, mellow, and grateful to the eye. They noted that lights could be controlled individually, that the system was safe and reliable, that this was clearly the future of urban illumination. Within months, hundreds of buildings in Lower Manhattan were wired for electricity. The Pearl Street station ran continuously, its generators humming day and night. Edison's vision of a complete electrical system was reality, but success brought new challenges that Edison had not fully anticipated. Other inventors and companies, seeing the commercial potential of electric power, quickly entered the field with competing systems and ideas. George Westinghouse, a brilliant inventor and industrialist who had made his fortune developing air brakes for trains, began promoting an alternative approach to electrical distribution based on alternating current, or AC, rather than Edison's direct current system. The technical differences between DC and AC were profound and would have far-reaching consequences. DC power, which Edison's system used, flowed in one direction through wires at a constant voltage. This was simple, safe at the voltages Edison employed, and well suited for the light bulbs and motors Edison had designed. But DC had a fatal limitation. It couldn't travel far from the power station. Electrical resistance in the copper wires caused voltage to drop over distance. After a mile or so, the voltage would fall too low to power lights effectively. This meant that every few miles of coverage required a separate generating station, expensive and inefficient for electrifying large areas or entire cities. A city like New York would need dozens or hundreds of power stations to provide complete coverage. AC power, as Westinghouse and his brilliant Serbian engineer Nikola Tesla demonstrated, operated on completely different principles. The current alternated direction many times per second, flowing forward and backward in the wires. This seemed more complex and perhaps less intuitive than the straightforward DC flow, but AC had a transformative advantage. Using devices called transformers, AC voltage could be stepped up to very high levels for long-distance transmission, then stepped back down to safe, usable levels where needed. This meant a single large power plant could serve an entire region, with high-voltage transmission lines carrying electricity dozens or even hundreds of miles, making the system far more economical for large-scale deployment. Tesla had worked briefly for Edison in the 1880s, but the two men had clashed over both technical approaches and money. Tesla, a trained engineer with a deep understanding of electrical theory, thought in terms of elegant mathematical solutions to problems. Edison, the empiricist, dismissed much of Tesla's theoretical work as impractical dreaming. When Tesla left Edison's employ after a dispute over promised payments, he took his AC motor designs to Westinghouse, who recognized their potential immediately. By the late 1880s, Westinghouse was installing AC power systems in cities across America, directly competing with Edison's DC systems. Edison watched with growing alarm as Westinghouse won contracts that Edison believed should be his. The battle between the two systems, DC and AC, became personal, bitter, and increasingly desperate. Edison fiercely defended DC, launching a public relations campaign against AC that would become one of the more shameful episodes of his career. He argued with genuine conviction that AC was dangerous, that the high voltages AC required for efficient transmission were deadly, lethal to anyone who came in contact with them, that his DC system was safer for workers, safer for the public, the only responsible choice for bringing electricity into homes where children lived. There was some truth to this. High-voltage AC was indeed more dangerous than low-voltage DC. A shock from an AC transmission line could and did kill people. But Edison's defense of DC went far beyond raising legitimate safety concerns. It became a campaign of fear designed to terrify the public about AC power and to associate Westinghouse's system with death. Edison staged public demonstrations where animals were electrocuted with AC current to demonstrate its lethality. In the most notorious incident, an elephant named Topsy, who had killed 3 men and was condemned to death, was electrocuted with AC current while Edison's associates filmed the event. dogs and cats were electrocuted in demonstrations presented to journalists and public officials. Edison's representatives would set up demonstrations showing animals killed almost instantly by AC shocks, while claiming that DC at similar amperages was harmless. The demonstrations were technically misleading. Any electrical current at sufficient amperage can kill, whether AC or DC. The question was not whether AC could kill, but whether AC systems as deployed were more dangerous than DC, and the evidence was far from clear. Edison also lobbied New York State to adopt AC for its newly developed electric chair for executing condemned criminals. If the state used AC for executions, Edison calculated, the public would associate AC with death, with punishment, with horror. The first execution by electric chair of convicted murderer William Kemmler in 1890 was botched terribly. The initial shock failed to kill Kemmler, leaving him unconscious but alive. The current had to be applied a second time, and witnesses reported the smell of burning flesh and smoke rising from Kemmler's body. It was gruesome, and Edison's representatives tried to ensure that newspapers referred to the process as being Westinghoused, attempting to link the horror directly to his competitor's name. Westinghouse was appalled and furious. He countered with his own publicity campaign, demonstrations of AC safety, and arguments about AC's superior efficiency and economy. He published pamphlets and articles refuting Edison's claims, bringing in his own experts to testify that AC, properly installed and used, was no more dangerous than DC. He pointed out correctly that Edison's scare tactics were based on high-voltage transmission lines, but that AC was stepped down to safe voltages before entering homes, just as DC was generated at safe voltages. The battle raged through the press, through scientific journals, through lobbying of state and local governments considering electrical systems. It consumed enormous energy and resources on both sides. Edison spent money on publicity that might have gone to improving his DC system. Westinghouse defended his reputation and his business against attacks that questioned not just his technology, but his ethics. The general public, largely uncomprehending of the technical details, watched two of America's most prominent inventors engaged in what appeared to be a bitter, personal feud. Behind the public battle, the technical and economic realities were deciding the outcome. AC was simply better for large-scale power distribution. The mathematics and physics were inescapable. A DC system might work well for a dense urban area like Lower Manhattan, where a power station every few miles was feasible. But for smaller cities, for rural areas, for the vast American landscape that needed electricity, AC was the only practical solution. Electric companies and municipal governments looking at costs and coverage increasingly chose AC systems. Edison's DC infrastructure, for all the capital invested in it, was being bypassed by superior technology. By the early 1890s, it was becoming clear that AC would dominate the future of electrical power. The Edison General Electric Company, recognizing this reality even if Edison himself resisted it, began to shift toward AC systems. In 1892, Edison General Electric merged with Thomson-Houston Electric Company, an AC competitor, to form General Electric. The new company would use both DC and AC systems as appropriate, but the direction was clear. AC was the future. Edison, who had fought so hard to defend DC, found himself marginalized in the company bearing his name. The merger had been driven by financial considerations and technical realities that Edison couldn't prevent. He was a shareholder and still involved in some capacity, but the company was no longer his in any meaningful sense. It was a bitter defeat. made worse because Edison knew deep down that he had been fighting physics itself. No amount of publicity or political maneuvering could change the fact that AC was more efficient for long-distance transmission. It was one of the few major technical battles Edison lost, and he never fully accepted it. For years afterward, he would insist that DC had been the better system, that AC was dangerous, that the shift to AC had been driven by greed and irresponsible risk-taking rather than sound engineering. History would judge otherwise. AC became the standard for electrical power systems worldwide, and it remains so today. Every power plant, every transmission line, every electrical grid operates on AC principles. Edison's DC system, revolutionary in its time, was relegated to specific applications where its advantages mattered: electroplating, battery charging, certain industrial motors. The war of currents was over, and Edison had lost. But while the war of currents consumed his attention, Edison's personal life was unraveling. His wife Mary, who had never quite adjusted to life with a man married to his work, was struggling. She developed severe headaches, possibly tumors, and her health declined through the early 1880s. Edison, consumed with the electrical light business, was often absent. On August 9, 1884, Mary Edison died at age 29. The official cause was listed as congestion of the brain, likely a brain tumor or hemorrhage. Edison was devastated, though characteristically he did not express his grief openly. He had been a distant husband, but he had cared for Mary in his way. Now she was gone, leaving him with 3 children: Marion age 11, Thomas Jr. age 8, and William age 6. The children would be raised largely by relatives as Edison returned to work, the only thing he knew how to do. 2 years after Mary's death, Edison met Mina Miller at a gathering of mutual friends. Mina was the daughter of Lewis Miller, a wealthy inventor and manufacturer from Akron, Ohio. She was 20 years old, educated, sophisticated, and nothing like Mary had been. Where Mary had been simple and conventional, Mina was cultured and strong-willed. She had attended finishing school, could speak several languages, and was accustomed to high society. Edison, now 39 and one of the most famous men in America, pursued her with uncharacteristic romanticism. He taught her Morse code so they could communicate by tapping messages on each other's hands during social gatherings. He proposed in Morse code during a carriage ride, tapping out the question on her hand. She tapped back, yes. They married on February 24, 1886. Edison purchased a grand estate in West Orange, New Jersey, called Glenmont, a sprawling 29-room mansion on 13 acres. It was far grander than anything he'd lived in before, reflecting both his wealth and Mina's social position. Mina brought order to Edison's chaotic life. She managed the household efficiently, raised his 3 children from his first marriage, along with the 3 children she would have with Edison: Madeline in 1888, Charles in 1890, and Theodore in 1898, and created a proper home. But she could not change Edison's fundamental nature. He remained obsessed with work, spending 16-hour days at his laboratory, frequently sleeping there rather than coming home. Mina accepted this, knowing she had married an inventor, not a conventional husband. In 1887, Edison built a new laboratory complex in West Orange, much larger than Menlo Park had been. This facility was industrial in scale, multiple buildings covering 2 blocks, employing hundreds of workers, equipped with the finest tools and equipment money could buy. It was designed to be a self-sufficient invention factory, where Edison could pursue any idea that interested him. The West Orange Laboratory would be Edison's base for the rest of his career, the place where he would develop his later inventions and spend his final productive years. The late 1880s and 1890s saw Edison working on multiple projects simultaneously, though none would achieve the transformative success of the light bulb or phonograph. He returned to the phonograph, improving it with a wax cylinder instead of tin foil, making it practical for both recording and playback. The improved phonograph became commercially successful, creating the beginning of the recorded music industry. Edison's phonograph company manufactured hundreds of thousands of cylinder recordings of music, speeches, and comedy routines. For the first time, people could listen to professional performers in their own homes. The phonograph made Edison wealthy, generating steady royalty income for decades. He also developed motion pictures, or as close to modern motion pictures as 1890s technology allowed. Working with assistant William Kennedy Laurie Dixon, Edison created the kinetoscope, a device that allowed individual viewers to watch short films through a peephole. The films were recorded using a camera Edison's team developed, using strips of flexible film manufactured by George Eastman. Edison built a film studio, the Black Maria, in West Orange, a strange tar paper-covered building on a rotating platform that could turn to track the sun for maximum lighting. In this studio, Edison produced hundreds of short films, vaudeville acts, boxing matches, dancers, exotic animals, anything that might interest viewers. The kinetoscope was commercially successful as a novelty, installed in penny arcades and exhibition halls. People lined up to peek through the viewer and watch 30 seconds of moving images. But Edison failed to recognize the potential of projecting films for group viewing. When the Lumiere brothers in France developed projection technology in 1895, Edison scrambled to catch up, eventually developing his own projector. Edison's role in creating the film industry is significant but complicated by his aggressive defense of his patents and his attempts to monopolize the American film business through lawsuits and business pressure. Not all of Edison's projects succeeded. He spent years in the 1890s trying to develop a system for extracting iron ore from low-grade mines using magnetic separation. He built an entire ore processing plant, invested enormous sums of his own money, and it failed commercially when new iron deposits were discovered that made the process unnecessary. Edison lost millions on the venture, possibly $2 million, a staggering sum at the time. It was his greatest business failure, and it might have bankrupted someone less resilient. Edison shrugged it off, reportedly saying, "It's all gone, but we had a hell of a good time spending it." By 1900, Edison was in his early 50s, still energetic but beginning to show his age. He had created multiple industries, held hundreds of patents, employed thousands of workers, and accumulated substantial wealth despite occasional failures. He had achieved everything he'd set out to do and more. But he was not finished. The 20th century would bring new challenges, new inventions, and eventually the long decline that comes to all men, even wizards. The early 20th century found Edison still working but increasingly focused on practical applications rather than breakthrough inventions. His laboratory continued operating, his companies continued producing electrical equipment, phonographs, motion picture equipment. But the era of revolutionary innovation was passing. Younger inventors were emerging with new ideas, and Edison, now in his 60s, was becoming a symbol of an earlier age. One of his major projects during this period was developing a better storage battery. Gasoline. Automobiles were beginning to dominate the market, but Edison believed electric cars had potential if only batteries could be improved. He spent 10 years developing a nickel-iron battery that was more durable and reliable than lead-acid batteries. It was good design, widely used in industrial applications, But it could not overcome the fundamental limitations of electric vehicles: limited range and long charging times. The gasoline engine won the battle for automobile dominance, though Edison's battery found success in other applications, particularly railroad signals and mining equipment. Edison also worked on improvements to cement manufacturing, developing more efficient kilns and processes. He built cement plants and even briefly promoted the idea of concrete houses that could be poured in molds, creating entire structures quickly and cheaply. The concrete house concept never caught on, though Edison did build a few examples that still stand. During World War I, Edison served on the Naval Consulting Board, advising the US Navy on technical matters. He was 67 when the war began, too old for active service but still respected for his technical knowledge. He proposed various inventions for naval warfare, most of which were not adopted, but his presence on the board lent prestige to the technical advisory effort. As Edison aged, he became increasingly a public figure, a symbol of American ingenuity in the self-made man. He gave interviews, posed for photographs, participated in publicity events. He became friends with Henry Ford, the automobile manufacturer, who revered Edison as an inspiration. Ford purchased Edison's Menlo Park laboratory buildings and moved them to his museum in Dearborn, Michigan, preserving them as historical monuments. Every year, Edison and Ford would take camping trips together, along with tire manufacturer Harvey Firestone and sometimes naturalist John Burroughs. These famous camping trips with four of America's most prominent men, sleeping in tents and posing for photographers, were as much publicity stunts as genuine recreation, but they seemed to give Edison pleasure in his later years. But the years were taking their toll. Edison's hearing, always poor, had declined to near deafness. He communicated primarily through written notes or by having people speak very loudly close to his ear. His health, never robust, was failing in various ways. Diabetes, which he'd had for years, was worsening. Stomach problems plagued him. He tired more easily. The 16-hour workdays became 12-hour, then 10-hour, then less. His last major invention was in 1927, when he was 80 years old. The US government asked him to investigate domestic sources of rubber, concerned about dependence on foreign supplies. Edison tested thousands of plants, eventually identifying a variety of goldenrod that produced usable rubber latex. He developed processing methods and established experimental farms. It was vintage Edison, the same exhaustive testing approach he'd used finding a light bulb filament, now applied to finding rubber plants. But by this time, Edison was clearly declining. He spent less time at the laboratory and more time at Glenmont. Mina watched him carefully, knowing that the end was approaching. His last years brought him numerous honors. In 1928, Congress awarded him a Special Medal of Honor. In 1929, on the 50th anniversary of the electric light, celebrations were held across America and Europe. President Herbert Hoover hosted a Golden Jubilee event where the lights in the nation were briefly dimmed in Edison's honor, then turned back on to celebrate his invention. The old man, now 82, attended the ceremony and was visibly moved, but he was very ill. The diabetes was causing complications, his kidneys were failing, a gastric ulcer was bleeding, he was losing weight rapidly, his famous robust build shrinking. By the summer of 1931, Edison could barely work at all. He spent his days at Glenmont sitting in his study or on the porch, sometimes dozing, sometimes looking out at the grounds. In August, he lapsed into a coma for several days, rallied briefly, then declined again. The doctors told Mina there was nothing more they could do. It was only a matter of time. Edison's children gathered at Glenmont, the 3 from his first marriage and the 3 from his second coming to say goodbye. The famous visitors stopped arriving, respecting the family's privacy. The press camped outside the gates, waiting for news. Through September and into October, Edison lingered. Sometimes he was conscious, sometimes not. When awake, he was confused, not always recognizing where he was or who was with him. But Mina was always there, holding his hand, speaking to him softly. On October 17th, 1931, in the early morning hours, Edison seemed to rally slightly. His eyes opened with something of their old clarity. Mina leaned close to hear what he was saying. His voice was weak, barely a whisper, but she heard him clearly. "It is very beautiful over there." She didn't know what he meant. Was he seeing something beyond the room, beyond this world? The great rationalist, the man of science who had spent his life dealing with material reality, seemed to be describing a vision. These were his last coherent words. Through that day and into the next, his breathing grew shallower. The family maintained their vigil. At 3:24 in the afternoon of October 18th, 1931, Thomas Edison took his final breath and was still. He was 84 years old. The news spread quickly. Radio stations interrupted programs to announce that Thomas Edison had died. Newspapers held their presses to prepare special editions. Around the world, the announcement was made that the man who had given the world electric light had passed. President Hoover issued a statement. He illuminated the path of progress by his inventions. Tributes poured in from every corner of the globe. Scientists praised his contributions. Businessmen acknowledged his industrial impact. Ordinary people mourned the loss of a man whose inventions had touched their daily lives in countless ways. On October 21st, 1931, the funeral was held at Glenmont. It was relatively private, limited to family and close friends, though thousands gathered outside the estate. Edison was buried in a simple grave on the Glenmont grounds, under a large oak tree, as he had requested. But the public commemoration came later. On the night of Edison's burial, at 10 p.m. Eastern Time, President Hoover asked Americans to turn off their electric lights for 1 minute in tribute. It was an unprecedented gesture. Across the nation, people switched off their lights. For 60 seconds, the country went dark, returning to the world as it had been before Edison, a world of candlelight and darkness, a world without the electric illumination he had made possible. Then, at 10:01, the lights came back on, the darkness lifted. The world Edison had created reasserted itself, and in that moment, the tribute was complete. The man who had brought light to the world was honoured by that light's brief absence, making everyone remember what he had given them. Thomas Edison left behind an empire of invention and industry that would take decades to fully appreciate and whose influence still shapes our daily lives in ways we rarely notice. His immediate estate was complex, divided among his 6 children, with Mina serving as executor. The various companies bearing his name, Edison General Electric, which had merged with Thomson Houston to become General Electric, Edison Portland Cement, Edison Storage Battery Company and others, continued operating under their own management. Some thrived and became industrial giants, some struggled and eventually faded, but all bore the imprint of their founder's relentless drive to turn ideas into products. The tally of his inventions is staggering in its scope and ambition. 193 US patents covering everything from the phonograph and the electric light to improvements in telegraphy, batteries, cement manufacturing, ore extraction, rubber processing and countless other fields. But beyond the patents, beyond the specific devices, Edison's real legacy was the model he created for how invention itself could be organized and systematized. Before Edison, inventors worked alone or with one or two assistants, pursuing individual ideas driven by personal curiosity or occasional commissions from clients. They were isolated geniuses, working in small workshops, sharing little of their process, protective of their ideas. Edison created something different and revolutionary: the Industrial Research Laboratory, a place where teams of skilled workers collaborated on systematic innovation, where invention became a corporate activity rather than an individual pursuit. He showed that invention could be a business, that research could be organized and directed toward practical goals, that innovation could be mass-produced like any other commodity. This model, refined and expanded over the decades since Edison's death, has become the foundation of modern technological development. Every modern corporate research lab, from Bell Labs, which gave us the transistor and the laser, to Google's research divisions working on artificial intelligence, descends from what Edison built at Menlo Park and West Orange. The idea that companies should employ scientists and engineers to produce innovations on demand, that research is an investment that produces valuable patents and products, that creative work can be managed and directed towards specific goals. This was Edison's contribution as much as any specific device he invented. The process of innovation itself was professionalized, systematized, and commercialized at Menlo Park, transforming invention from a mysterious act of individual genius into a repeatable organizational capability. The electric light remains Edison's most visible and transformative legacy. Every light switch is a reminder of his work. Every illuminated street, every lit home, every office building where work continues after sunset carries forward the revolution Edison began. The infrastructure of electrical power generation and distribution that covers the globe, that makes modern civilization possible, traces back conceptually to the Pearl Street Station and the integrated system Edison developed. When Edison threw that switch in 1882, he began a transformation of human civilization as profound as the discovery of fire. Before electric light, the productive day ended when the sun set. People had candles or gas lamps, but both were dim, dangerous, and expensive enough that most people simply went to bed when darkness fell. The world operated on daylight hours. Factories closed at sunset. Streets were dangerous and dark. Reading after nightfall was difficult and damaging to eyesight. Electric light changed everything. Cities became safe at night, with well-lit streets that discouraged crime and allowed commerce and entertainment to extend into evening hours. Factories could run multiple shifts, operating continuously, vastly increasing productivity. Reading and work could continue after sunset without eye strain or fire hazard. Architecture changed fundamentally. No more need for large windows in every room when artificial light could illuminate interior spaces perfectly. The 24-hour society we take for granted, with its night shifts and late-night businesses and around-the-clock activity, became possible because Edison made electric light practical and affordable. The phonograph created an entire industry that has evolved through multiple technological revolutions but remains fundamentally based on Edison's insight. Recorded music, which did not exist in any form before Edison, became a major part of human culture and a vast commercial enterprise. The ability to preserve sound changed everything from how we remember the past to how we experience entertainment. Before the phonograph, music existed only in the moment of performance. If you wanted to hear Beethoven, you had to attend a concert. If you wanted to hear your grandmother's voice, you had to be in her presence. All sound was ephemeral, vanishing the moment it was created. Edison's invention meant that sound could be captured, stored, transported, and replayed. Voices could be preserved after death. Musical performances could reach millions who never attended the concert. The spoken word could be recorded for posterity. Edison's cylinders evolved into discs, which became vinyl records, which gave way to cassettes, then CDs, then digital files. But the fundamental concept, sound captured and reproduced mechanically or electronically, came from that December day in 1877 when Edison recited "Mary Had a Little Lamb" into a crude machine and heard his own voice played back. The recording industry that emerged, worth billions of dollars and touching nearly every human life through music, audiobooks, podcasts, and countless other applications, began in Menlo Park with tinfoil wrapped around a brass cylinder. Motion pictures, though Edison did not invent them alone, and arguably contributed less to their artistic development than pioneers like the Lumiere brothers, D.W. Griffith, or later film innovators, owe something significant to Edison's kinetoscope and his early film studio. The film industry that emerged in the early 20th century eventually centered in Hollywood, began with inventors like Edison experimenting with moving images. The kinetoscope, with its short films viewed through a peephole, proved that audiences would pay to watch moving pictures. The Black Maria studio, primitive though it was, demonstrated that films could be produced systematically as commercial products. Edison's aggressive enforcement of his film patents, while controversial and ultimately unsuccessful in creating a monopoly, helped establish the legal and business frameworks within which the film industry would develop. But Edison's legacy has controversial elements. His bitter fight against AC power, including his willingness to electrocute animals and promote the electric chair to associate AC with death, was a low point. His aggressive enforcement of patents, suing competitors and attempting to monopolize industries, earned him many enemies and stifled some innovation. His treatment of other inventors whose ideas he appropriated or whose contributions he minimized, notably Nikola Tesla, who worked briefly for Edison before their famous falling out, mars his reputation. Edison was not a saint. He was difficult, often ruthless in business, dismissive of theoretical science, and scientists who questioned his methods. He could be cruel to employees who failed to meet his standards. He worked his assistants brutally, expecting them to match his own inhuman work hours. His parenting, especially of his children from his first marriage, was neglectful at best. Yet the breadth of his achievement is undeniable. In field after field, Edison took emerging technologies and made them practical, commercializable, and accessible to ordinary people. He was not always the first to invent, but he was often the first to make inventions work reliably and economically. In the decades after his death, Edison became a mythic figure, the embodiment of American ingenuity and the self-made man. Schools were named after him, textbooks held him up as an example, and his most famous sayings, whether he actually said them or not, became part of American culture. Genius is 1% inspiration and 99% perspiration. I have not failed. I've just found 10,000 ways that won't work. There is no substitute for hard work. These aphorisms captured something essential about Edison's approach, the belief that persistence and effort could overcome any obstacle. That failure was simply part of the process, that success came from relentless experimentation rather than brilliant theoretical insights. The debate over Edison's place in history continues. Some historians emphasize his ruthlessness and willingness to claim credit for others' work. Some note that many Edison inventions were really created by his assistants, with Edison providing direction and taking patents. Some point out that Edison's empirical approach, testing thousands of materials without theoretical understanding of why some worked, was inefficient compared to science-based approaches. All of these criticisms have merit, but they do not diminish the essential fact. Edison changed the world. The light bulb, the phonograph, the motion picture, the storage battery, improvements to the telegraph and telephone, these inventions and hundreds of others reshaped human civilization. Whatever his flaws, whatever controversies surround his methods, the results speak for themselves. When you flip a light switch, you are living in a world Edison helped create. When you listen to recorded music or watch a film, you are using technologies Edison pioneered. When you charge a battery or use any of the countless electrical devices that fill modern life, you're benefiting from the system of electrical power Edison and others developed. The boy who was called addled and thrown out of school, who sold newspapers on trains and lived in boarding houses, who failed thousands of times and fought bitter battles with rivals, created technologies that billions of people use every day. From that Port Huron basement laboratory to the industrial research complex at West Orange, from the first crude phonograph to the mature electrical power system, Edison's life was a testament to the power of persistence, curiosity, and the refusal to accept that something cannot be done. He faced every challenge the same way, by trying everything until something worked. He had a vision of invention as systematic exploration, testing every possibility until the right answer emerged. It was not elegant, it was not always efficient, but it produced results. Consider the paradoxes of Thomas Edison's life. Here was someone who could barely hear, yet he gave the world recorded sound and claimed his deafness was an advantage. Someone with 3 months of formal schooling who became one of history's greatest inventors and America's most celebrated scientific mind. Someone who failed more often than he succeeded, conducting thousands of experiments that led nowhere, but whose successes transformed civilization more profoundly than most kingdoms or empires. Someone who was both visionary and stubborn, generous to those who worked loyally for him, and ruthless to competitors, a man of science with little patience for scientific theory, an inventor who became a businessman, and a businessman who never stopped inventing even when profit was unlikely. Edison believed that nature yielded its secrets to persistence and hard work, not to theory or mathematical elegance. He famously clashed with university-trained scientists who approached problems through theoretical frameworks. "I can always hire mathematicians," he reportedly said, "but they can't hire me." There was truth in this. Edison's empirical approach, for all its inefficiency, produced practical results that more theoretically sophisticated inventors missed. The carbonized bamboo filament for the light bulb was discovered through testing thousands of materials, not through theoretical prediction of what should work. The carbon button telephone transmitter came from methodical experimentation, not from elegant physics. Edison proved that systematic trial and error, given enough persistence and resources, could solve problems that stumped those who relied on theory alone. But his approach had limits. The war of currents showed what happened when Edison's stubbornness clashed with superior technology. AC power was better for long-distance transmission, and no amount of persistence or experimentation with DC could change the physics. Edison's refusal to accept this cost him commercially and damaged his reputation. The greatest irony may be that Edison, who spent his life creating technologies that brought people together through sound, light, and images, was himself increasingly isolated. His deafness cut him off from normal conversation. His work habits kept him away from family and friends. He was most comfortable in his laboratory, surrounded by assistants and equipment, working on problems that had clear technical solutions. Human relationships, which cannot be solved through experimentation and do not yield to persistence alone, remained somewhat mysterious to him. His first wife was neglected, his children from that marriage felt abandoned, and even Mina, who managed to create a stable home life, had to accept that she would always compete with the laboratory for her husband's attention. Yet Edison was not a cold person. He was generous to loyal employees. He enjoyed the company of friends like Ford and Firestone. He took pride in his children's achievements, and he mellowed in old age. The relentless, driven inventor of his youth became a more reflective figure in his final years, someone who looked back on his achievements with satisfaction and perhaps some surprise at how much he'd accomplished. When Edison whispered, "It is very beautiful over there," in his final hours, what did he see? Was it a vision of an afterlife, unexpected from a man who put little stock in religion? Was it simply the hallucination of a dying brain, given meaning by those who wanted his last words to be profound? We cannot know. But there is something fitting in the ambiguity. Edison spent his life making the invisible visible, turning ideas into concrete things, bringing light to darkness and sound to silence. Perhaps at the end, facing the ultimate mystery that no amount of experimentation can illuminate, he allowed himself to acknowledge that some things remain beautiful precisely because they cannot be explained, tested, or reduced to wire and filament. The light bulb remains the universal symbol of a good idea, a bright thought emerging from darkness. Every cartoon character who has a moment of inspiration is drawn with a light bulb appearing above their head. This is Edison's lasting cultural impact, that we cannot think of innovation without thinking of the device he spent years perfecting. The Smithsonian Institution in Washington preserves one of Edison's original light bulbs from 1879, still capable of glowing if connected to current. The simple glass bulb with its carbonized bamboo filament represents one of the most important technological achievements in human history. It changed how we live as fundamentally as the wheel, or the printing press, or the steam engine. And Edison knew it. For all his talk of hard work and persistence, for all his rejection of genius in favor of perspiration, Edison understood that he had accomplished something extraordinary. He had brought humanity out of darkness in a way no one had before. He had made the night yield to human will, had made silence preserve voices across time, had captured motion and frozen it in flickering images. These were achievements worthy of the title wizard, even if the magic was really hard work, brilliant assistance, financial backing, and thousands upon thousands of experiments. Glenmont still stands in West Orange, preserved as a National Historical Park. Visitors can tour the estate where Edison spent his final years, see the study where he worked, the bedroom where he died, the grounds where he's buried. A few miles away, the laboratory complex, also a National Historical Park, preserves the workshops where so many inventions were developed. Walking through these spaces, seeing the equipment Edison used, the notebooks where he sketched ideas, the artifacts of relentless creativity, one gets a sense of the sheer scale of his ambition and accomplishment. This was not a man content with a single invention or a single field. He wanted to innovate in every area that interested him, and almost everything interested him. From telegraph systems to motion pictures, from concrete houses to rubber plants, Edison pursued ideas wherever they led. Not all succeeded, but the failures taught him as much as the successes, and he never stopped trying. If this journey through Edison's life has given you something to think about, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. I'm curious which of Edison's inventions has most shaped your daily life. Leave a comment and share your thoughts. Until our next journey into the past, I wish you a calm and peaceful night. Thomas Edison lies buried under an oak tree at Glenmont, far from the boardrooms and laboratories where his inventions changed the world. But his legacy illuminates every corner of modern civilization. He taught us that genius without persistence is merely potential, that failure is simply information about what doesn't work, and that the greatest inventions serve human needs rather than theoretical elegance. He showed us that one person, working with determination and surrounding themselves with talented collaborators, can reshape how billions of people live. The boy dismissed as too stupid to learn became the man who taught the world to see in the dark, to hear the past speak, and to witness motion frozen and replayed at will. Every light that glows, every sound that's recorded, every image that moves on a screen carries within it the echo of Thomas Edison's relentless question, how can this be made to work? And so our journey ends, but the light remains. Good night.